I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Josh Hammer.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we're going to start by Ben taking us through a little bit about new Hunter Biden storylines. He's now suing the IRS. It's going to be good. So just be ready, because Ben is going to take us through some of the details of that. Josh is going to go through the entire saga as it relates to Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, which is so fascinating and has so many layers, and I'm very excited to unpack. I'm going to talk a little bit about Yoel Roth, who you may remember was the safety head of Twitter. He had some weird Orwellian title over at Twitter, but he's out with a new op-ed in the New York Times that is saying democracy is bad for democracy. Basically, he's upset about congressional hearings and is saying it's all a targeted attack, a strategic, vast right-wing conspiracy against the tech oligarchs who are just doing their darndest to keep us safe every day. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And Inez is going to talk about the resurgence of Me Too and Russell Brand. So on that, we're going to toss it to Ben first to talk to us about Hunter Biden.
Well, thanks, Emily. And last week, as per usual, there was another development in the Hunter Biden case, which coincided with developments in the Joe Biden impeachment case, namely the opening of an impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden. And just several days after that, special counsel David Weiss in Delaware handed down an indictment which the DOJ had telegraphed, slapping Hunter Biden with a 3-count indictment dealing with gun-related charges, namely false statements that he put on paperwork to purchase a gun, about not using drugs or being addicted to illegal drugs, as well as possessing a firearm while a user of or an addict. In this case, in Hunter Biden's case, of cocaine. These are long-known offenses, yet, of course, he's only being indicted with them today. And perhaps most notably of all, these are the offenses that are most untethered from the Biden multi-million-dollar international influence peddling scheme, which is the whole basis in reality, or should be, for the investigation and prosecution of Hunter Biden. Now, context here is important. It's not clear that these charges would have ever even seen the light of day had a few developments not happened before this. Namely, IRS whistleblowers coming to the fore this spring to allege brazen misconduct by the DOJ, as well as some investigators in connection with this case, in essentially stymieing and subverting not only the investigation and prosecution of Hunter Biden, but also obfuscating and sabotaging the pursuit of any leads to Joe Biden. We know that there have never been offenses put forth in an information or an indictment around Foreign Agent Registration Act violations, money laundering, etc. Any of the more serious charges, again, with a direct nexus to Joe Biden by dint of the fact the Biden family international influence peddling scheme would never have existed without Joe Biden having served for decades in the swamp. By the way, as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman before he was vice president, before he was president. And so what are we to make of these charges that ultimately arose only after, again, the whistleblowers came to the fore? The DOJ felt compelled to rush to prosecute on some kind of grounds. They cooked up a sweetheart plea agreement, which had a pretrial diversion agreement in it around these gun charges, enabling Hunter Biden to skirt jail time and get a global immunity, get out of jail free provision. And only when that collapsed did it ultimately lead to Weiss becoming a special counsel and the issuance of these charges. Well, in my view, this is a total and complete head fake. The reason you charge him on the least Joe Biden related crimes is because you feel you have to save face as an institution. It's not clear necessarily how any kind of litigation is going to play out. Hunter Biden's counsel, by the way, maintains, or has maintained previously, that pretrial diversion agreement with the get out of jail free card in it is actually active. So there's going to be litigation over that. Some have speculated that one of the reasons that the charges might have been brought against Hunter Biden is to prevent him from having to testify before Congress, perhaps in connection with the impeachment inquiry. And then beyond that, obviously this raises questions about, well, would Joe Biden, for example, pardon? Is this part of some kind of deep state plot to get Joe to step aside, et cetera? But I think the most important thing that I keep going back to is this is part of the continued cover up of the Joe Biden chairman international influence peddling scheme, because it hides the most Joe Biden related crimes. And we're still waiting on the purported tax, quote unquote, tax charges, which only derived from that international influence peddling operation, let alone any FARA or other charges to be brought. Where's the beef should be the question to Special Counsel Weiss. But of course, under his prosecution, prosecutors have already let the statutes of limitation lapse on the Burisma related tax crimes at a very minimum. So of course, the cover up has already been effective to this point. So with all that laid out, the questions that I had to ask are, do you all see this as the kind of head fake that I see it as? And to what extent, if any, does this impact the impeachment inquiry and the trajectory of the 2024 race more broadly?
I also think one interesting thing is it's possible they're strategically using charges that will relate directly back to Hunter Biden's addiction as a way for Joe Biden to only talk about the addiction. And I'm not saying anybody's sitting in some smoke-filled back room like saying, okay, let's have Weiss charge him only with this thing because it'll be better for PR. I'm just saying it's obviously better for PR to anybody who's sympathetic to Biden and is involved in bringing charges or the litigation here, that Hunter Biden's addiction issues with the gun in particular, it's just much easier for Joe Biden to say, this is my son who's been suffering. We've seen the White House roll out that argument actually more in recent days, which tells me that there's obvious truth to the fact that it's just these are much easier for the White House to talk about than these really deep, concerted foreign lobbying efforts. And FARA violations are a felony. They locked Paul Manafort up for some really egregious FARA violations. They didn't, of course, lock Tony Podesta up, but that it is a felony not to disclose when you are lobbying on behalf of foreign governments. So if he ends up never getting charged with FARA, which seems to be the trajectory that we're going down right now, and there are ways to just sort of do, Band-Aids there are ways to charge someone with FARA and not ever put them in prison, which again, there's Paul Manafort and there's Tony Podesta. See what the difference is between the two of those when it comes to the narrow question of FARA. If he never gets charged with a FARA violation and it's never treated seriously, I won't be surprised, but the level of foreign lobbying that he was doing, the scale of his influence peddling was vast, to say the least. So that would be really pathetic.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with both Emily and Ben that these are obviously the charges that are the furthest away from what the actual heart of the matter is, which is what Hunter Biden was being paid for, right? And I'm honestly a little bit just fed up with the idea that we're supposed to continue to hedge our language. There really are only two options here. One is that Hunter was selling Joe Biden's influence, which it seems it's impossible to even imagine selling that influence without at least the knowledge of Joe Biden. Two, we have to imagine that foreign oligarchs are willing to spend millions and millions of dollars without actually getting anything in return over the course of years. They're just that stupid that they're willing to repeatedly spend huge sums of money to pay for influence that doesn't exist. And that just, it seems so incredulous that I'm a little bit tired with all the hedging here in terms of saying, oh, we don't have enough information. Just from the information that is in the public, right? We know that those are the two options. And I don't know about you guys, but I think it's very implausible that powerful oligarchs around the world spend their millions like water without actually following through and making sure that they're getting anything for those millions. I mean, that is really what the press is asking us to believe, is including some mainstream Republicans or moderate Republicans are sort of asking us to maintain this extremely skeptical and fair-minded posture when those are the two options. And I feel like yes, obviously it's good to get, if we're talking about crimes, obviously it's innocent until proven guilty. But in the case of public opinion, and how we evaluate the president, and for political remedies, I think that defensive crouch is at this point unnecessary. Just what's in the public sphere, I think adds up to more than enough, first of all, for impeachment to actually begin. And second of all, for Republicans to start talking about the fact that Joe Biden is obviously corrupt without this defensive posture of, oh, we need more evidence.
So there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, we've already unpacked a lot of it. I'll try to be as brief as possible. So first of all, I mean, the sheer duration of time from this 180-degree turn from this pretrial diversion agreement that was then rejected by the judge to then indicting on numerous gun offenses is really just shocking. I mean, if you by the crow flying, looking at a calendar, it's roughly 6 weeks or so. So something is obviously up here. Now, I think like the superficial explanation, which I saw a lot of people gravitate to, is that, oh, Weiss got his hands caught in the cookie jar and all of that. He's trying to make amends to it. But as Ben pointed out, these are crimes that are furthest removed from the very conduct for which Speaker McCarthy has now opened an impeachment inquiry. This has obviously nothing whatsoever to do with the big guy. So where my mind kind of first went when this news dropped last week was, maybe kind of the Biden crime family in classic kind of Don Corleone fashion, kind of, called the addle-brained prodigal son and was like, all right, take one for the team here. But then you kind of have to say, well, is he actually going to take one for the team here? Because he's not going to jail. I mean, yes, these criminal accounts add up to potentially 25 years in the slammer. And if his name were not Biden, he would 100% end up in jail time. These crimes are clear as day. I mean, the moron that he is, Hunter Biden literally admitted in his memoir that he was a crack addict at the time in 2018 that he purchased this Colt revolver. I mean, this is about as straightforward a prosecution as it possibly gets. Prosecutorial discretion, doesn't get you that far when you already have a special counsel in the first place. By the way, a special counsel who was a sitting U.S. attorney in direct violation of the Code of Federal Regulations, but that's a whole nother issue for another day. So at the end of the day here, my column on this, what I concluded was, this is like going to be the regime exposing itself here. If the investigation stops here, if there's no investigation into the foreign business dealings, no investigation into FARA, none of these much, frankly, more potentially damaging and offensive to the body politic charges, if they stop here, and ultimately, if he doesn't go to jail, then, everything that conservatives have basically said about the two-tier system of justice, I think, basically will be vindicated. Really quick on a final thought here. Another thought that I had when this dropped last week is, because everyone listening to this podcast knows Hunter's not going to jail. So one way that this plays out is Biden pardons his son as an excuse to, and then the optics are so bad to kind of satisfy the yearnings of the Times and the Post and everything, and then kind of not run for re-election. I don't know. Just putting it out there as possible food for thought. All right, let's transition though for the sake of time. So there was other big news over these past few days, over this past weekend down in my former state of Texas. Attorney General Ken Paxton was acquitted of all 16 charges that the House overwhelmingly impeached him for. The vote there in the House was really shocking. The Speaker of the House, who is a moderate Republican, I guess would be a polite way of saying it, really kind of corralled much of his caucus to join Democrats to impeach Ken Paxton on 16 counts by, again, a shockingly high margin there. When I saw that tally kind of come across the feed, my eyes kind of just bulged. And after a prolonged trial, he has now been acquitted, so he is back to being the active Attorney General. He has been suspended from his duties now, going back 3.5, almost 4 months or so since late May. So we don't have the time to go into kind of the full history of Ken Paxton's various kind of legal issues. I'm very close to the Paxton situation. I mean, not that I do know Attorney General Paxton a little bit, but I'm barred in Texas. I've had so many friends who have worked very closely for him. And that closeness kind of colors the way that I view all of this. So again, Paxton has had a legally checkered past. He was first indicted for securities fraud going back to 2015. He still has an upcoming trial for securities fraud. That situation has never been settled. Earlier this year, Joe Biden's DOJ announced they were going to open a federal probe into possible public integrity. But the actual allegations here that he was ultimately acquitted by the Senate pertain to just basically straight up venality and corruption, specifically pertaining to a prominent pro-Paxton donor by the name of Nate Paul, who's a real estate developer. The allegation is essentially some sort of quid pro quo arrangement where in exchange, either explicit or implicit, in exchange for I think it was $25,000 donation from Paul to Paxton's 2018 campaign, Paxton would redirect state funds to help his various legal issues, try to quash prosecutions into Nate Paul's private sector dealings. Incidentally, through Nate Paul, Ken Paxton met a woman with whom he had an extramarital affair that he ultimately admitted to make this story even more dramatic. Of course, Ken Paxton's wife, who stayed with him, Angela Paxton, is a current state senator who helped lead the charge in his defense. So it's kind of like it's really kind of a Texas-sized drama. Ken Paxton is a controversial figure, and I'll be curious for all of your thoughts on him. I ultimately come down on the side that I like him and support him because he is a warrior. I mean, he files more lawsuits against the Biden administration than really kind of all the other Republican attorneys general combined, if I had to guess. I don't have a statistic off the top of my head for that, but I bet if you looked it up, it probably is true. Not all of them are meritorious. Some of them are admittedly meritless. His attempt in kind of December 2020, around the time of the post 2020 election litigation back and forth, he filed this kind of Hail Mary lawsuit that I think only one justice would have been able to kind of hear. It was a bit of a Hail Mary. So sometimes he tends to overstretch here, but he is definitely a warrior against the Biden administration and against the substantive forces of progressivism and liberalism. However, I can tell you, again, going back to my own experience and my own familiarity with the relevant actors in the Texas legal system, because of all of his drama, he has really bled talent, and he now has a huge problem with recruiting top-tier lawyers. So I really cannot exaggerate enough the importance of the Texas Attorney General's office, the Texas Solicitor General's office, and their division of special litigation. I cannot emphasize enough how important that whole office is as far as kind of the red states' legal battles with Democratic administrations. Texas has been leading those battles really for 20 years, ever since Ted Cruz was Texas Solicitor General from 2003 to 2008. Other states have started to kind of pick up the steam here, but basically the entire special litigation division in the Texas AG's office over the past few months has left. That division is essentially non-existent here. And I think that there were very legitimate questions going forward as to what that office will look like while Ken Paxton, despite his prolific nature, is going to be so wounded as far as recruiting. Will he be able to keep on filing lawsuits? Another question for you guys, I guess, and I'll throw it open on this. Another question is, what about the fact that he's an open adulterer? Do we even care about that anymore? There's also, Kristi Noem also this past week, we saw the Daily Mail. People are defending that. So that's a whole nother conversation as well here. So there's really a lot to unpack here. Again, I generally defend Ken Paxton because I think that he is a warrior against the left, but I see the man for the flawed and somewhat tragic figure that he is. So I'm curious for everyone's thoughts on that.
I really don't know much about this case and about the Texas situation and all of the dynamics that Josh just laid out. So I'll leave that in my comments, but to speak to the last bit of what you said about, let's say, moral standards in the Republican Party, I think it's notable that worth remembering that Trump was the first Republican nominee who did not have to have a come to Jesus moment about his sexual past. Right. So it's not that the Republican Party has not had figureheads and nominees for all kinds of positions who were former adulterers, divorced, et cetera, but all of those people, including, for example, someone like Newt Gingrich, all had to sort of fall on their swords before the voters and profess that they were living a different life now than when those incidents occurred in order to get forgiven by Republican voters. I think since 2016, this is essentially not true. That Republican voters do not care about the personal lives of their nominees. I think this is sort of inevitable, given the way that the left wields hypocrisy as a very, very potent political weapon, not against the people falling short of the standards, but against any kind of moral standard itself, right? You can think of hypocrisy as a double-edged weapon against Like you could either wield the charge of hypocrisy against the behavior that falls short of the standard and use hypocrisy to like the hypocrisy charge to call out that behavior, or you could use the hypocrisy charge to wield against the moral standard itself. In this case, to say, well, yeah, well then don't go around preaching about marriage if you've fallen short of that yourself. And I think I think that's the wrong way to think about hypocrisy. But I think the left has gotten so much mileage since the 90s out of the charge of hypocrisy against Republicans on sexual matters, that Republican base is basically fed up and doesn't care. Now, do I think that's a good thing? It's hard to say. I mean, I think there are definitely, it's definitely indicative of sort of a continual erosion of moral standards. And to that extent, I think it's a bad thing. But in the current sort of fight with the left, if Republicans are the only people who care about those standards, it has been wielded really, really aggressive and successfully against the right. So I can understand why people are just sort of throwing up their hands and saying, well, we don't care. We just want someone who's going to fight for us.
I think with Ken Paxton, there's this, he was modeling in the early days of the Trump era, the kind of activist, creative attorney general position that a lot of other people have sort of followed in the footsteps of in those years, to Inez's point, that if somebody is kind of demonstrating they're a fighter, so to speak, which is, I think it's fair to say, and Josh would know more about this, but I think it's fair to say that he took that position and made it something that a lot of people don't, that a lot of people just sort of rest more comfortably on their laurels and aren't looking for creative activist ways to really strike at a corrupt administration or the left in general. And a lot of Republican voters at this point have said, no matter what the sort of internal party politics are, and no matter what the left is trying to wield, and we'll probably talk about this in Inez's segment too, against this person, I value their ability to undercut the forces of corruption, the forces of evil, forces of immorality, way more than I need them to be sort of a moral standard bearer. And the other thing I was thinking of with this whole case, which is like super complicated, is that one party states, a place like Texas where you have one party rule for a really long time, or California, man, that is a tough position to be in. I saw it in my own home state of Wisconsin when Republicans dominated over the course of like the last decade. You have to be really, really, really careful when you're in that situation, because it just breeds internal dynamics like this as people are jockeying for power within their own party, and that gets you so far afield from what voters actually care about.
Yeah, so I won't comment on the merits of the impeachment case to the extent there was a case. I saw the highlights that probably a lot of you saw, exposing this to be a frivolous exercise. I've heard and read some about how this calls to mind kind of like the Bushies versus the conservative dynamic that certainly exists within Texas as well. And I'm sure that's a big part of it. And as I always go back to, the establishment Republicans fight no one harder than they do conservatives. And this may be an instance of that as well, but I'm sure there's much more as well to it. I also think it's worth noting that this also comes up against the backdrop of not just obviously the political indictments happening right now, but also particularly the effort to disbar John Eastman in California, which is ongoing. And the reason I link these two is not because the conduct is by any way necessarily analogous or equivalent, and I'm not making any comparison between Eastman and Paxton, but this once again shows you how these institutions are being weaponized against figures who do take on the regime in one way or another. In Paxton's case, of course, he headlined maybe the preeminent suit around the 2020 election and tried to take it before the Supreme Court, something that Eastman, of course, did support, an effort he supported. So no good deed goes unanswered. If you're taking on the regime in any way, you are going to have the regime, left or right, come down on your head. And so I do think this is another instance of that. We've kind of, not to beat a dead horse on the character and morals issue, but I think all of us would love to live in a society where our political representatives were paragons of virtue, were noble, did practice what they preached, etc. I think you have to weigh that now against the issue of knowing what time it is, and are you willing to tolerate sometimes very flawed leaders in their personal lives who lack personal virtue and morality in context of the greater good of fighting against those forces that Emily was describing. And I think it's very clear that most Republican voters are saying we are willing to tolerate people who do not necessarily represent what we hold dear in their own lives, because this is what time it is. And I think this is probably one instance of that.
Yes, sorry, super quick, and then we got to go to Emily. But I just want to clarify that it's important to note that one argument that the Paxton team made in their defense, which I actually found very persuasive, was that the voters already voted on this. Most of these napalm allegations were out there by the time Ken Paxton beat George P. Bush, Jeb's son, by like 37 points in the Texas Republican AG primary last year. So that's I found that argument quite persuasive, actually.
So the next segment here is on Yoel Roth, who's the former head of Trust and Safety. I think it was his actual like formal title at Twitter, old Twitter versus new Twitter. So I guess that would be BE before Elon, the BE era. Yoel Roth was the head of Trust and Safety, which he's then implicated in all kinds of nefarious decisions. We see it, in his email. At times, he's weighing. These are emails that came out in the Twitter file, and they're emails that have come out in lawsuits and other things like that. We have just a glut of information from inside Twitter during those days. A, because of Elon Musk taking it over, and B, because there have been lawsuits and all that stuff involved. But we have a glut of information showing that he was in constant communication with the government, meeting regularly with intelligence agencies, was a part of the decision to throttle the Hunter Biden laptop story. And while it's true, he was at sometimes weighing the value of speech over political correctness, whatever it is, in the aggregate, he was essentially a censor. And one that was sort of being controlled by the shadow government, not even like democratically, but by intelligence agencies run by people who are not elected whatsoever, who were pressuring him to do different things. And he was basically fully on board with it for the most part. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times this week that has to be read to be believed. I'm going to do my best to capture it here, but he is essentially arguing that it's a perilous moment for democracy. And the rest of the piece is complaining about congressional hearings and journalism. I'm not making that up. The attacks on democracy are coming from inside the House, is essentially the argument here, that there's too many congressional hearings and too much journalism. He complains about the Twitter files. He complains about congressional hearings that are probing Twitter's inappropriate behavior and inappropriate conduct over the course of the 2020 election and over the course of the pandemic. That's genuinely something he's casting as this like vast right-wing conspiracy to target and create victims out of people who are involved in this. And it's actually really important and worth talking about here, because what you're seeing is an experimentation with this new line of argument that what the tech oligarchs were, what these sort of petty bureaucratic censors were, is that sort of bulwark. Again, like they are the protectors of public safety. They were just doing their best. Everyone else that is now, as Missouri v. Biden likely heads to the Supreme Court, and make no mistake, that's 100% why Yoel Roth is rolling this out the Monday, the following week, Monday, after we learned about that, is because he's trying to undercut the credibility of everyone that is now having, I think, success at stopping the government and tech censors from interfering in elections. It's absolutely why he's doing what he's doing. And it's just a really pathetic argument. And I think it's one, though, we're going to see more and more of. I don't know if you guys read the whole op-ed, but I do think it's just so telling that he sees democracy in the same way so many elites do. They love to celebrate democracy, but actual democracy is really upsetting to them because they don't have control over it. They fundamentally don't trust the American people. Democracy to them is actually oligarchy, but they like to have that illusion of democracy where people vote, but when that vote is wrong, they step in. What did you guys think of this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, democracy is everything except what the people decide, right? And there's so many examples, and there's so many directions to go with this. Honestly, I'm sure Ben will take the election angle and warn us all about what's coming, and I think he'll be completely right to do so. That this is going to be a mess of an election, and we are not, I think, as we are not as worried as we should be about it. In terms of what the fallout will be, but I'll leave that to Ben and say only that I wrote about Yoel Roth when the Twitter files came out and when Twitter changed hands to Elon Musk, basically casting him as an archetype of a large part of what our GDP is now. And I think we have to grapple with this, that in fact, a large part of what we're producing, our credential system is producing, are well-paid ideological officers. And this is now a function that is supported by the private sector. And it's the idea that, and we've talked about this many times, that the structure of the way of not only of censorship, but of many of the workings of the current regime have this sort of dual structure between government coercion and an entire, and many times not even coming directly from the CEO, but like an entire structure within private companies of all of these people who have been credentialed basically to be political officers, and their job, their very well-paid job, is to be political officers. Those people are creating a large part of our GDP that's simply fake. It's not adding, it's worse than fake because it's tyrannical, but it's also not actually adding to the bottom line. And I really wonder how long such a thing can go on before it really starts to sink the profitability of companies. I mean, we are already seeing some encouraging signs about, DEI officer positions not being renewed or not being filled, because it's not because of, every CEO is like Elon Musk politically, but because simply that this is an enormous cost in the economy. And honestly, as much as, I know we try to fight this from the sort of political and ideological perspective, it may be that to some extent, in this backwards horseshoe way, we've looped back into the free market perhaps being the best defense we have. Because one of the things that's given me hope is that, when those bottom lines start tightening up, and as we continue to be in a rocky place economically, companies are simply dispensing with people like Yoel Roth, and that will obviously be very, very, very important and an improvement for this country.
Well, first, Emily was right to note the Missouri v. Biden development, which is that the feds are trying to push at least the preliminary injunction in that case up to the Supreme Court. And so it's more than ironic that Yoel Roth is raising these arguments the Monday after the Friday in which we found out the feds are trying to push that case to the Supreme Court. Ironically, in that case, what the plaintiff showed is that there was this massive concerted effort of coercion and intimidation and browbeating and haranguing by the feds to get social media companies to censor, converting those social media companies into state censorship arms. And yet what Yoel Roth says is there's a campaign, a concerted effort of coercion, intimidation, cajoling, etc. now to go after the censors. And they are the real bad guys here. And they are the ones who are, I guess, engaging in a conspiracy against rights or something like that. So the irony here is unbelievable, but precisely what you expect. And what the real story here is that as he shows, the censorship industrial complex, even though he dismisses the Twitter files and doesn't even really mention Missouri v. Biden, has been wholly exposed. And the counterattack on the censors is actually winning. It's certainly winning in the courts. It's winning to extent in public opinion. The cutouts that the censorship industrial complex used to accomplish its goals are being scrutinized, and they loathe that. And so, of course, they're going to recoil to the position of it's a threat to democracy to stop censors from allowing democracy to actually work and having free and open discourse of ideas. Now we have to attack them. That is clearly the strategy that they have to work with. And their strategy, essentially, we are the victims, actually. The censors are the victims, not the people who are combating the censorship in defense of those who have been censored and actually victimized here. Last point I'd make is, obviously, we could talk about the criminalization election speech that you can see in these indictments and draw a nexus probably to social media censorship around if you say something about elections that could somehow impact voting patterns, that thus you've engaged in a conspiracy to violate people's rights. And you can imagine people being prosecuted for that wrongthink because frankly, it's already started. But it's also, I think, another aspect of this that Yoel Roth is laying out is, look, those engaged in the censorship industrial complex are now being attacked for being exposed, and watch the feds try to use that themselves in their arguments in defense of this regime as they try to take it to the Supreme Court. Just like, by the way, in an analogous situation, Jack Smith and the feds are arguing, well, Trump has to be gagged because people are being threatened because Trump says things in a judicial context.
I don't have a whole lot to add here. We're running low on time for this segment. So, I mean, I will just very briefly note that you can't possibly say enough about irony would be a too polite way to say it, the dripping from the veins hypocrisy of when these people have the gall to talk about democracy. I mean, whether it is in the big tech censorship context, whether it is in really any other context there. I mean, in Israel, they've been having this judicial reform debate. The Israeli Supreme Court just last Tuesday, they convened all 15 justices for the first time in the history of that court. It's normally less than the full 15 panel, to hear an appeal about this extraordinarily mild, moderate law, which basically says that the court cannot strike down a cabinet level appointment for being unreasonable. And, it's called anti-democratic, obviously, it's unelected. But the whole thing is just such a mess. I mean, like you just cannot say enough about the hypocrisy of these deeply, deeply anti-democratic people who invariably are just mini tyrants and little Robespierres themselves.
All right, Inez, talk to us about Russell Brand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not someone who cares overly much about Russell Brand, but I do think this case is worth discussing for really three reasons. So just in terms of the factual background, there's been essentially an expose, long time in coming, about in which a quite long list of women from Russell Brand's self-admitted wild past come forward and say that their encounters were of varying levels, non-consensual. The reporting mixes a couple serious charges with a bunch of non-criminal and unserious charges in a intentionally confusing way. But there are really 3 points that I think are relevant here to the broader picture. One is the timing in politics. Russell Brand famously lived this way for a long time. He was like, can't remember what award they gave him, like the man who's shagged the most women in the UK award or something, right? So they were cheering this. The media was cheering him in living his life this way until he decided to stop living his life this way and start criticizing the left. He's not a conservative, but he has criticized some cultural ticks of the left, and that has put him in the crosshairs. So the media timing of this is incredibly suspicious, given the fact that all of these allegations are from sometimes decades ago, which again makes the truth or falsity of them very, very difficult to adjudicate, just as in the Kavanaugh case. But I think it's worth noting this is the first big political, I think, a way of weaponizing or incident of these Me Too allegations being weaponized since the Kavanaugh hearings. Obviously, Russell Brand is a celebrity, not a Supreme Court justice or nominee, right? But the timing of this seems explicitly political, and in that way, I would compare it more to what happened to Joshua Katz, right? Where he was having affairs with students apparently, but people knew this before and they did nothing about it. And he's hardly the first, professor to have sexual relationships with his students. It's so common. It's an archetype, right? But they weaponized it against him for a political purpose because he was politically stepping out of line in the university. This has the same sort of feel to it. The second important point, of course, is the standard of accusation, right? The mere accusation is enough to completely ruin someone's life. It doesn't require further proof. And that's just a reminder that I know this sounds very 2017, 2018, but this tool in the toolbox, in the political toolbox, has not gone away. And it is still being wielded to destroy people's reputations and their lives in a way that's not really that flips the standard of innocence on your head, right? If you have accusations like this in public, you are now in the position of having to prove yourself innocent. Another, I think, good comparable case is Joseph Massey, who had a very tumultuous and mutually tumultuous and immiserating relationship with a woman, but in order to defend himself from untrue charges that were leveled against him, he had to kind of, strip down in public, right? Emotionally strip down in public. He had to talk about all of his, psychological sort of his past of abuse, like in his family, like all his psychological problems, everything, and I think that that itself can be the punishment that is enough to deter people from, saying the wrong thing politically. And third, the messiness of these situations themselves. I thought that this era was sort of coming to a close. This called girl boss feminist era culturally was sort of coming to a close, and that even the left was starting to admit that there were serious problems with this kind of framework. But we seem to be cycling back with this case into a framework where consent is both treated as a simple matter and as the only lodestar for appropriate sexual behavior. It cannot carry either one of those burdens, in my view. It's not enough. Consent is not enough to distinguish between the good and the degrading in the sexual, right? And or the violative. Consent is not functional, as it is not. It just isn't a concept that is capable of doing that. And when it's stretched to try to encompass what it is that is good or bad sex, it becomes tyrannical. And two, it's not as simple as people imagine, except in the most obvious cases, right? We all know, like, forcible rape, right? Is obviously a lack of consent, but the model of consent doesn't allow for women to be uncertain about their own consent or granting functions, which is very, very much part of the natural sexual dynamic between men and women, that men push and women sort of say no until they say yes. And there's no recognition of that natural dynamic in human sexuality. But in fact, that's almost always what's at play in these cases, whether the men pushed too far or not, whether they behaved appropriately or not, whether they behave criminally or not. Oftentimes this dynamic is at play, and it's a dynamic that the left is not even capable of talking about because they don't acknowledge differences, both physical and psychological, between men and women and our different evolutionary drives and so on. So anyway, this is not a resurgence I'm happy to see in terms of I thought this was sort of buried by 2018, that Me Too had become a joke and an afterthought in the culture. But apparently this is still not only still alive, but is still a potent weapon to be used with impeccable political timing. And with that, I'll throw it out to the rest of the view to discuss whether that's whether this is a workable standard, where such accusations are going to go, here's an important question, I think, how we should treat these kinds of obviously timed accusations from the media. Obviously nobody on this podcast is going to take the believe all women standard, but what should the standard of the public now be towards these very conveniently timed accusations?
Well, I think that's the tough thing. I mean, I don't know that. I actually feel like the Me Too fervor definitely died down, and I don't know that this is indicative of a pattern that's going to expand, thankfully. Maybe I'll be wrong. I think Russell Brand is super unique in that he's a creature of the left who's become a critic of the left and has this sort of heterodox Bernie bro audience that sort of brings in also like MAGA people and centrists. But his story is so critically, I think, based on the fact that he used to live this insane life. Like, that is central to what Russell Brand is now, is that he's open about how disgusting his life used to be, essentially. So there's just nothing surprising about the fact that, he may have done things that were inappropriate and much worse than that, potentially. And so I don't think this fundamentally changes anybody's opinion of Russell Brand, unless it had happened like yesterday or a month ago or a year ago, which most of these haven't. And I also don't think anybody is looking at Russell Brand as a moral paragon. They're looking at him as someone who's like an entertaining political commentator, not a senator from the moral majority or their pastor. So I think, people should always weigh the political factors, involved in this. I think the new thing that I've seen the left talking about with Russell Brand is that he intentionally cultivated an audience that would be skeptical of Me Too accusations because he knew since 2017 that the allegations were going to at some point come out. And so he was like building this empire specifically to shield himself from Me Too. I don't believe that. I think if anything, it's probably Me Too radicalized a lot of men against the left, and that's incidental. These things are sort of connected, but not intentional. The women have had their say. Now for the men.
Well, unfortunately, I mean, the standard is obviously neither believe all women or believe no women. I mean, by definition, this is like a fact-specific thing. We obviously should be incredibly skeptical when you have, I mean, these news stories or allegations that come up, years, decades later. I mean, Trump is dealing with some of this himself, right? I mean, like one of these lesser discussed legal dramas that he allegedly like groped someone in like a department store off Fifth Avenue 25 years ago. I mean, give me a break. I mean, he's dealing with enough as it is, right? Oh crap! I was gonna say something else, but I lost my train of thought actually. So Ben, maybe if you want to kind of take over.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously a lot of different angles to this. It was notable. Glenn Greenwald pointed this out that the New York Times kind of framed this as Russell Brand, who's built his empire interviewing conservatives. Like that's how he's risen, as opposed to his interesting and heterodox views and critiques of individuals and willingness to talk to people who are outside the left liberal bubble. Obviously, who gets attacked and at what point and on what grounds, or how you have to judge all these cases. I think, by the way, the notion that we don't believe everyone or disbelieve everyone, obviously, that is the way that we should be rendering judgment in society. You look at the facts and then you evaluate. But I don't think that is certainly where the left wants society. I mean, we are pushing into a time where it's very hard to imagine, like in the context of a jury, for example, in a politically charged case, that people are going to look at things and try to render judgment fairly and dispassionately. It's like we are in a post actually look at things objectively and render judgment in that sort of independent, neutral kind of way era. And I think it's clear in everyday life we see, that in a court context, you're kind of operating under the threat of mob rule, depending upon what the case is, if it's a politically charged one. So, as for this particular one, I hadn't heard about those conspiracy theories about he's building this empire to insulate himself, but that's even more conspiratorial than I would normally go in terms of thinking through one of these scenarios. But it is notable, obviously, that he's being attacked on these grounds when he's reached this point of his heights and powers, and when he's been kind of an open book about his misconduct or perhaps worse in the past. But I think, again, this is a signal to anyone who is heterodox, anyone who dares dissent from prevailing orthodoxy. You're going to face, at very minimum, process that is punishment. And maybe it's merited in this case, but would it have ever arisen had he not taken the positions that he's taken or interviewed the people that he's people? And I think it's obvious, probably not. And that puts us in a very sad and disturbing kind of society, and something of a death spiral, quite frankly, when kind of the politics of assassinating people personally becomes the norm, and it's everywhere, and it continues to grow and grow.
All right. You know what time it is? It's time for final thoughts. Josh, what have you got for us?
Well, fortunate as the case may be, Emily, I actually just remembered what I had a brain fart on just like a minute or two ago, which was I wanted to kind of elaborate on a very profound point that Inez just made that I think deserves to be highlighted a little more, which is this idea that consent is not the end-all be-all paradigm. And we know that this is the case when it comes to the power dynamics of hookup culture and male-female relations and all that more generally. But consent is really kind of the sine qua non of the liberal worldview properly construed in the first place, right? I mean, if you take kind of classical liberals, left liberals, right liberals, libertarians, if you take all of them at their word, then consent really should dictate anything. I mean, if someone just consents to be a prostitute, if someone just consents to do fentanyl, whatever, then shrug your shoulders, no big deal here. But I mean, this is obviously a deeply, deeply watered down, amoral, and ultimately untenable and unsustainable worldview. And it's not a direct analogy. I mean, we're talking about consent in a very specific context here. We're talking about Russell Brand and kind of Me Too culture and all of that. So it's not a direct kind of side-by-side analogy. And one might say that you can have consent here and not consent there. And I'm trying not to paint with broad brushes here. I'm merely trying to say that I get really, really frustrated when just in general, in kind of a social, cultural, political, even kind of a legal context, when people try to make out consent to really be all that matters. I mean, some things are just wrong for the sake of being wrong, and legislation, the law, should frankly just say as such. I mean, obviously consent should, if someone consents to be murdered, I mean, what does that even mean, right? I mean, that's kind of a silly example, I understand, but the whole thing just ultimately collapses on its head. So I was really grateful that you made that point, Inez, and I just wanted to underscore that.
Well, I'll follow up on that some more as well, because like you, Josh, I think it is it's a framework. It is the ultimate framework in kind of the liberal world in which we float, and it dispenses with the very obvious idea philosophically that people can consent or want things that are bad for them, right? And this sounds like so obvious as to not even be worth saying. But it is remarkable how little people on the left, and then even some people on the right, are unable to just state this directly, because they have relied so strongly on the idea that people's revealed preferences add up to a positive society, right? That they've completely dispensed with the very basic concept that human desires can be either wisely or well directed and shaped by education, by culture, by law, right, towards good ends, or they can be impulses that actually enslave us, right? That this is a very basic, philosophical idea for 4,000 years, and yet it's something that, if I say out loud, sounds wildly reactionary in today's culture, because we're so used to this baseline standard in the way that we talk about politics, culture, life, personal decisions, anything else, where it's, it's all about discovering who you are and what you want, and then the world is tyrannical if it doesn't, follow through and give you those things. This is exactly opposite to the understanding of the good life and human flourishing, not just in, the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition, but in virtually any successful, human philosophical tradition until the equivalent of a few seconds ago. And I think it's a decision or a transition that we don't think about because we literally swim in it all day long, but it's clearly and fundamentally wrong.
Well, on a totally different matter, and very briefly, there's been a development in the Senate of a change in dress code to accommodate Senator John Fetterman. And I just want to say that to the extent we are going to have hoodie-clad and sweatsuit-wearing members of the U.S. Senate, if there wasn't a signal before that the West was dead, this is the signal. That's it. That's all I got today.
I mean, I think that's let's say appropriately pithy, because it does feel just like a kick in the gut, even though I'm someone who is so opposed and annoyed by the snobbery. Inez probably is one of these snobs, the sartorial snobbery about airports and blah. Oh my gosh, give me a break. But the Senate, I can ride an airplane in jeans. I can ride an airplane in tennis shoes. I should not be legislating for the country in jeans and tennis shoes. And John Fetterman also, let's remember, is a LARP. He is not your actual, back before Carhartt was hipster, he's not, just getting off the construction site and wearing Carhartt because it allows him maximum flexibility while welding. No, he's wearing it because he likes to LARP. He's a rich kid who has been taken care of his entire life, went to Harvard, and maybe he understands and he's at least smart enough to grasp the aesthetic of the working class. But it certainly is not native to John Fetterman in any way whatsoever. So it's disturbing on so many different levels. And you know, back to my original final thought, because I didn't know Ben was going to drop that. And fantastic that he did. My original final thought was going to be back to Russell Brand, and just that, like, it's just impossible for anybody to know what to believe. Like, the waters have been so muddied. Me Too was a huge muddying of the water. You had, as Inez said in the beginning of her segment, like legitimate claims being lumped in with ones that were just borderline at best, and personal, non-public involved in all of that. So just from the perspective of a journalist, there's always questions about whether something is newsworthy. There are always, you know, questions about sourcing and motivations and all of that. And these are questions members of the public now have to ask when they read journalism, because the journalists aren't answering them with any clarity or sort of like moral grounding themselves. It's just sort of, we feel like this is really bad, but you guys decide. So it's one of those things where, like, I don't know, like, did Russell Brand intentionally for years build a talk show because he knew Me Too allegations were going to come out one day? No, what was more likely that happened is, like many men who, you know, enjoy the commentary of Jordan Peterson or Dave Rubin or all of these different people who offer something different from what the so-called mainstream is offering them, he probably did see Me Too and think, wow, this means that, you know, things I've apologized for and repented for from years in my past might be coming to get me. And I'm not going to build this talk show as a shield. I'm actually just, like, really upset by this. I think it's wrong. And like, I want to talk about it. So I think it's to the left's detriment to think conspiratorially about these things instead of understanding how these things are affecting men and women and everyone. So on that note, we did Fetterman, we did Russell Brand,
We did Emily needing to dress better at airports.
Yes, goodness. I knew you were on the other side of that. How did I know? Coastal elite. Your name is Inez. All right. Well, on behalf of Josh, Ben, and Inez, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.